You're watching Nice Behind the Scenes, a space for conversation about community, collaboration, and the future of journalism. I'd like to welcome now Conrad Benner. He is the founder of Streets Department and one of the initial members of the News and Information Community Exchange. What's up, Conrad?
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. I want to start with just a kind of an acknowledgement that you are at and surpassing the 10-year mark. You are producing a original series for WHYY. You got murals up around the city and you're doing stuff at the flower show. What word or words would you use to describe the way you feel about yourself and your career right now?
I feel like to an extent I've arrived at a place that I've been working towards for many years. The blog started 10 years ago, as you mentioned. It really started as kind of a fanboy blog. I was working at a coffee shop, a gelato shop, Cappuccino Gelato, when I started, going to community college part-time. And it was, I had written some freelance work before, worked for a blog called Frequency and some other stuff, but was really interested in like creating my own sort of space and documenting things the way I wanted to, which is really photo driven. And I love street art. I love walking around the city. So I just combined a bunch of my interests and built Streets Department that way. And who knew 10 years later it'd be something I'd be curating murals in the public space for, or working with WHYY to extend the content, to have conversations not only about art in the public space, but public space more generally.
Is there a tip or best practices you could share with other creators and how you consistently build these audiences across platforms?
Yeah, I think early on, one of the best decisions I ever made early on was deciding to keep the blog hyper-focused and hyper-local. As I mentioned, for a few years before, I was a freelance writer for, Philly Mag, Philly Weekly, all those sorts of things. Doing like a fashion thing for this publication and a home interiors thing for this one, writing about music for another one. So when I wanted to do my own thing, it was really about like, okay, let me zoom in on something, right? What am I really interested in? And when you can sort of talk about things that maybe other folks aren't talking about in sort of a bigger scale, people come to you, And I danced around that. I really thought for a minute when I started the blog, like maybe it could just be a blog where I could bring in a bunch of my, friends and people I admire to write articles about just like life in Philly, music, art, movies, dining. And for a minute it was that. And then I had a few conversations with a few people. One, how do I manage that? Two, how do I get sponsors for that? And three, is that really what I'm interested in? And it kind of wound down to, I'm really just interested in art in the public space, about access to art, about access to public space. And, I believe it's a big equalizer in a way, right? We live in a world that is so commercial and so commoditized. Our time is commoditized. But the public space is really one of the handful of spaces we have in this world where you can just go and you aren't expected to engage in commerce, right? You can just go to a park and lay out and read a book. You can take a walk down your street and see public art. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it.
So what is it that some of the followers are telling you? What are some of the comments that you hear after these 10 years of covering public space and art?
It's been really, I feel like there's been a big hug around me. I've done this like announcement so many different ways because, 10 years is a long time. I'm going to keep talking about it this whole year. I was just interviewed by Grid magazine and so I posted about it and someone was like, oh, I didn't know it was your 10 year. And I was like, how have you not known? I've been talking about it endlessly. I did a 2-month photo exhibition talking about the 10-year anniversary. But I mean, that says something about how the algorithms kind of hold content back from some folks. But I've been really just felt like a warm hug around me. So many people in the blogging and media communities have, sort of patted me on the back, talked about how that's a great achievement. Blogs were still relatively new in 2011 and so many came and went. A couple were rolled into WHYY like PlanPhilly, right? But I've still managed to keep this independent and keep it going over the years, even though it's like fluctuated. And then from the artists and then from the readers, it's just been, I think, an exciting time to think back and look back at installations that happened 6 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and think about how things have changed and evolved and artists have come and gone and artists have been inspired by other art. You know, there's a yarn bomber in Philly right now called Cole Nicolich. Lace in the Moon is her Instagram handle. And she does this incredible yarn work all around the city. But 10 years ago, I was documenting an artist named Ishnitz who was doing equally incredible stuff around the city. So it's interesting to see these trends and these artists be inspired by one another and kind of flow through time. You know, 10 years is a long time, but it's also not. So I'm excited for now, like my 30th birthday, 30th anniversary, to see what that kind of perspective would offer.
One of the personalities I watch online said something recently that really hit home with me. I mean, it wasn't, and I mean, it was something that I followed when I was doing tech book. Like I always told people, I covered politics, police, and protests. That's where that was my niche. And there's riches and niches. Like, you know, people try to get so big and do everything and be, you know, and spread themselves thin. And you are an example. And I like to think my career was an example of when you find one thing that the market is missing and you cover it well and you provide a unique viewpoint and you bring together people who are really passionate about it, you can create a really, really rigorous and robust community. And that can have a whole lot of social benefits, financially and social.
Yeah, that's, you know, think about it too. When I started the blog in 2011, like Instagram wasn't even around. So if you were someone in Philly interested in street art, interested in murals, you kind of either had to wait for the Inquirer or Philly Mag to write about something, which would happen from time to time. They'd highlight an artist or an installation. But there was really not a whole lot of places you could go aside from like, you know, indie art galleries that were maybe having a street art focus show or something like that. So Instagram came around, of course, hashtags made it a bit easier to find that content. But when the blog started, there wasn't even that. So yeah, having it be super hyper focused on something, I think early on opened a lot of doors for me in sort of readers' minds. I mean, in the first year of the blog, I went from starting the blog in January, meeting artists almost immediately. Artists were inviting me out to installations with them, to coffee, to learn, to shoot installations, to, you know, interview them and stuff. And by the end of that year, by October, I was hosting my first curated art show, which we called Streets Department Presents at Philomoka. And we invited just a bunch of artists from that year to come out and exhibit. So the first year was really exhilarating. And I think it was an example of, yeah, when you sort of hyper-focus and you sort of build a community around an issue or a topic, it can go places.
I want to know, Conrad, you talked about how there was really a lack of reporting and coverage about art in public space, but Philadelphia has a reputation nationally, if not internationally, for not only its mural art, but its public space and gardens. Tell me a little bit about what you've learned about Philadelphia over the last 10 years as it relates to public art and space.
Yeah, well, there's so many different ways to approach that. Well, one, we're like the green country town, right? So we were designed to have public spaces be sort of a center of our civic life, right? The four squares of Center City that in some way expanded as the neighborhoods expanded. You know, in theory, there should be parks in every neighborhood. And we're the public art capital of the country. We have the oldest and largest mural program in the country. Sorry, not oldest, largest mural program in the country. I think LA had a mural program before Mural Arts Philadelphia. We have some 4,000 murals, some like 1,000 pieces of public art, some 1,000 monuments. We are really a leader around the country and around the globe. You know, Mural Arts Philadelphia, for example, which has been around for about 37 years, works with city leaders across the country and across the globe to build networks of murals like they've built. Murals and public art have been increasingly popular with cities. I think a lot of cities see them as ways to build little tourist destinations. You see things like Wynwood Walls in Miami or Crush Walls in Denver or murals in the Mark in Detroit that are super concentrated districts of murals that do attract a lot of people. They're for the community there, but they're also, you know, tourist attractions in a sense and support surrounding businesses. But in Philadelphia, you know, with organizations like Mural Arts Philadelphia, there have been a more egalitarian approach to public art making. So we have some 3,000 murals that still stand for Mural Arts Philadelphia, but they're across the city. They're in every neighborhood. They're all across the city. So there aren't these huge concentrations, which is a really interesting approach to mural making, right? It's not about building these districts as it's about creating art with communities, creating art in communities and building access to art, tearing down those walls in a sense. So yeah, I think not only do we have a large number of pieces of public art and street art or pieces of public art, but we also have this really unique way of approaching public art making, which is about making it for everyone. Now on the street art side, that's the commission side, right? And when you talk about art in the public space, there's commissioned and then non-commissioned. That's all sort of on the commission side. On the non-commission side, we have a great history of street art and graffiti here in the city of Philadelphia. The modern day graffiti movement, of course, graffiti has been around since like ancient Egypt, but the modern day graffiti movement, led by the spray can, started about 12 years after the invention of the spray can, which makes sense because you kind of want to get in and out pretty quickly. And it started here in Philadelphia and in the Bronx around the same time. Philadelphia was led by like Cool Earl and Cornbread, folks like that, and it was mostly tags. Street art is an evolution of graffiti. It's this idea of taking spaces in the public space and putting artwork on them. Most artists and writers now work on abandoned buildings or construction material, which I think most people view as kind of open spaces for creativity like that. So you'll see wheat paste go up on an abandoned building or a construction material and no one will complain about it and it'll stay there for 9 or 8 months, I think that shows one that, in one way, artists have learned to use these spaces to keep their stuff up longer. And two, communities in cities like Philadelphia really appreciate the non-commission side of public art making just as much as they like the commission side. There's so many advantages to both. Obviously, there's funding on the commission side, artists get paid, but on the non-commission side, there's no walls, right? There's no curators, there's no funders. You can kind of do whatever you want. As long as the community likes it and doesn't complain about it. If they do, it'll get buffed.
One of the things I was really curious about was the streets department name, because when I first discovered you, I thought you were an extension of the city of Philadelphia. And I'm sure other people have said that. Why'd you choose that name?
To confuse people.
Did you really?
So, okay. It's hard to like build a brand from scratch, right? Especially with like no money, no funding. I'm not like going to build billboards across the city, right? So my thought was to follow, I'm grunting because I hate even talking about this, because Perez Hilton is a very bad example of a blogger. He's created a lot of strife and done a lot of really negative things, I think, for the world. But Perez Hilton did that thing where he took a famous person's name, changed it a bit, and then it was easily recognizable, right? PerezHilton.com. You hear that name sort of once and you kind of remember it. And I thought a name like Streets Department would do a similar thing. Like you hear the name Streets Department, it's pretty easy to remember. We're talking about art in the public space. You think about streets, you think about street art. And the other thing I was thinking was when you see a Streets Department truck go by, it was almost like free advertising for me because you might make that association.
Yeah, you're making that mental connection.
Free billboards running around the city for me.
I think congratulations are also in order because you did some posters at the beginning of the year that are now being included in the art museum collection. Tell our audience a little bit about that and how do you come to terms with something so big?
Yeah, that is bananas to me. So I have been really inspired by how people, really inspired and interested and intrigued by how people have used their windows this last year. So through COVID, a lot of us have stayed home, not the essential workers, but a lot of us have stayed home, have had to stay home. And from early on in the pandemic, we saw rainbows in people's windows. That was an initiative really created by the 1% or One Philly Art Program, which told people to put rainbows in their windows to show people in your neighborhood that we're in this together. And there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Then, of course, with the historic Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020, we saw people take their protest signs from the protests and then put them in their window. I talked to a lot of people who just said that they didn't want to throw those signs away. They were meaningful to them and the messages were important. So those started to go in people's windows. Then, of course, the election of 2020, one of the most contentious elections in modern American political history. So we saw even more political signs in people's windows. People were using their window as this quasi-public space because we were in our neighborhoods more, we were home more. It was a way to communicate your values and your hopes and your dreams with your neighbors in your community. It was like your own little billboard. So when Biden was named the winner 10 days after the election, I had a conversation with Jane Golden from Mural Arts, and I said, what if we build this poster project where we work with 10 Philadelphia artists? It then grew to 13. We asked them sort of what are the hopes and dreams policy-wise that they have for themselves and their community to push this new administration forward in their first 100 days. You know, the first 100 days is so important. You learn so much about a new president and vice president's priorities and what they're really going to out the gate start fighting for. And as a 36-year-old man, you know, you see election wins like Obama's in 2008, where you sweep someone into office like Obama, and then you hope things just get done. But if you don't stay into the fight with that person, it's hard to get things done, right? And Obama then lost the midterm election in 2010, and then next to nothing could happen. So it's sort of my goal, my hope, to bring artists together, to continue to use the public space and sort of the zeitgeist to push for these really important progressive policy issues like canceling student debt, which is something that Biden and Harris ran on. We can't forget that. He ran on canceling student debt. It's an obligation he made to us that he has to come through with. Upping the vaccines, which of course the administration has been really great at vaccinating the country. And other issues like reallocating bloated police budgets back to communities, which is really important too. So there are 13 posters created by 13 Philly artists. We didn't dictate the policy issues. I asked them what they were interested in doing posters about. Almost all of them picked different issues. There were a couple who were in the reallocating police funds camp, so we had to move some people around to other issues to make sure that there wasn't any overlap there. But yeah, we created the 13 posters. Almost immediately, the Philadelphia Museum of Art reached out to us and said, we really like this project. We love the artwork and the posters that the artists made. Can we bring this into our permanent collection? And my jaw just dropped. I emailed the artists immediately. Like half of us were crying, laughing, cheersing. We were just stunned. It's not easy to have your artwork or your project be accepted into the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's a permanent collection. So, you know, we're still just stunned by it. I mean, the news just broke. We knew back in February. There were a lot of like official, you know, papers to sign and hoops to jump through. But yeah, we just announced. And I just found out too, they're in the permanent collection, which basically means they go into the archive, they have the posters, they get like laminated, or I don't know what they do. But so the paper can stay around for eternity. They go in the archive. And in theory, 300 years from now, there could be a project about protest art from this moment, and they could come back up into the exhibition. Now, what we just learned was that the museum is actually really interested in having these posters on view sooner than later. So that's still to be determined, but I know a couple of the curators there are working with the museum to figure out how these posters could be on view maybe this year. I don't know, we'll see.
Let's switch real quick to news. Why'd you join NICE, and what has it been like for you so far?
I joined because you called me after we finally got in touch. We had like this 3-hour phone call in the middle of the I was like, I still remember that day because we just had this really great engaging talk about like what news is, what it could be, who are the people telling the news, who are the people gathering community information, community resources, community sources to get the news out there. And we have this great sidebar too about like what were my goals as streets department and how am I trying to push myself forward. And I think I'm really passionate about growing this blog, about building these projects, but there are things that I don't have the skill and understanding to do, like finding funding resources. That's always been a challenge for me, or time management. So I was interested in joining this, one, because I believed in the mission of it. Two, I thought I had something to offer maybe other folks in the, I almost said guild, but, you know, in the community of NICE that we were building. And I wanted to learn stuff too, you know, I thought it was a perfect opportunity. All that aside, I also kind of want to be the new Terry Gross. So that's part of it. Terry Gross when we retired, you know.
And so what's it been like for you? I mean, are you happy that you joined? Have you met interesting people?
Friday. So we have these like weekly calls on Fridays that are just like little Zen moments every week. Sometimes they're just sort of check-ins with the different members of N.I.C.E. We kind of talk about what we're doing, see if there's ways to support each other. And then other times, Eric is bringing on like an expert in XYZ that's been really helpful. The grant funding one was really insightful for me too, because it's like I had some preconceptions about grant writing and the grant process. And through that, I learned that I wasn't alone in thinking it was really hard for independent folks like me to get grants. It's still possible, but it's just tougher. And so I thought that conversation was really enlightening. No, I'm so glad I joined. Yeah. And I feel like it's only just begun still, you know, I mean, we're about to launch. Well, we can't talk about that.
But it has absolutely just begun. So, you know, one of the things that Eric and I talk about with N.I.C.E. in terms of both of how it came to be, but what we've talked about so far with ourselves and with POC and what we're going to be talking about with others is this concept that the future of journalism is people. And this concept that we should prioritize people over platforms and access over algorithms and community over content. When you hear terms like that type of phraseology, people first journalism, what does that mean to you?
You know, it means to me that I feel like so much in the press, it's copying and pasting press releases. You know, there are people who have easy access to press, and press are at a historic moment of, you know, underfunding and, you know, changes in how the market, how people are wanting to access and read and digest news and information. So there's all of these challenges in sort of the media landscape right now. And so one easy thing to do is to just kind of like, in my opinion, copy and paste press releases. There's so many things I see in local and national media. And, you know, John Oliver talks about this too, like the same report will be across like 10,000 local news stations. It's like, I understand why stuff like that happens. Like everyone's underfunded right now. The challenges have never been greater than they are. But it seems like there isn't enough space for like the news that's happening at the neighborhood and community level, which is really dangerous in my opinion, right? Like certainly I'm not the only person saying that, but we have some of the lowest voter turnout. You know, a lot of the projects I work on are around voter engagement. We have some of the lowest voter turnout in like US history. And that's in part because one of the number one reasons people say they don't vote is because they don't know enough, which, you know, we as people in journalism, as people in media, have to figure out ways to get this news and information to people. You know, as local neighborhood papers go away, you might know less and less about the school board in your neighborhood or what judges to vote for based off of what record. It seems like just a few years ago, most people didn't know what a DA was. Of course, we had a really energized campaign around the DA a couple of years ago, so I think most people now know what that is. A lot of people don't know what the city controller is and how important that job is, let alone like who's running. So, you know, there's so much stuff to get out there that's, in my opinion, more important than just like what restaurants opening where. Not to pick on restaurants. I shouldn't pick on restaurants right now, actually, because they've been through the worst year ever. But you know,
you're not picking on the restaurants. You're picking on the actual journalists and reporters who continue to regurgitate those stories, right?
Yeah,
I'm interested in where you see the overlap or the importance. You used a phrase earlier that it's dangerous. What makes it dangerous, and where do you see the responsibility lying for reporting? Is it on the community? Is it on journalists, or is there some bridge between the two?
Well, I think it's dangerous because the fewer people we have engaging in our politics, the fewer people we have voting, the more, you know, minority rules, and we have, you know, an outweighed number of voices deciding the people who get elected, which then dictates everything, you know. I think it can be really easy to feel jaded and to feel like things don't change because things move really slowly. but things do change in the long run. And it is important to be engaged and to stay active civically and with voting. Now, look, so many things are stacked against us, right? Like voting should be a 2-week thing, right? There are plenty of countries that voting is the national holiday where like basically everyone has off. So there's so many hurdles for people to vote. That's one side of it. But as far as like hurdles to information about what's going to be on the ballot, why are those positions important? Who are the people running and how do they differ from each other? Those are huge tasks to ask for media to invest in, especially when you talk about judges races, right? There are so many judges running. It's a nearly impossible task for local media to do without gigantic funding and investment, public or private, I guess. But yeah, I think it's sort of everyone's responsibility to want to fight for this information. You know, I have a podcast, and season 3, which is my most recent season, was a traveling podcast. It was right before the pandemic, and we went to Phoenix, Arizona, and Denver, Colorado. Just 2 places I'd never been before. I thought they were maybe interesting cities I could learn things about. Phoenix is doing really interesting things with their public space. They're growing. It's a growing city. But in Denver, I interviewed 2 people who ran for city council. They both grew up in this neighborhood of Denver. I can't remember the district right now, but they both grew up in this neighborhood that was quickly transitioning. In conversation with them, I kind of compared it to like Fishtown or Kensington, you know, a neighborhood that was working class and that was becoming like the arts hub of Denver. They both ran and lost their election. And in the conversation I had with them, they were saying they would knock on people's doors and talk about this amendment that was going to be on the ballot or this thing that was up in city council. And they said no one knew what they were talking about. And it was things like the number, you know, single family row homes versus like building denser apartment buildings, when one of the biggest issues in that district was lack of housing or the rents going up, you know. So these are issues that affected people's everyday lives that they didn't have access to information for. Now, it also happened that this campaign was happening about 2 years after that neighborhood's local newspaper shut down. They think part of the reason both of them lost was this sort of this voter base that didn't have the information to make smart election choices.
Uninformed voters, right?
Uninformed voters. So what they did is they got a little mad, and then they started a newspaper. You know, I think you get mad when you lose an election. I don't want to project and say that they're mad, but they started a newspaper, a community newspaper for that district. The 2 of them weren't similar ideologically either, so that, you know, they're bringing a lot of different approaches to it. I thought that was such a smart thing to do. They found the funding, and we just need more of that. You know, we need people like WHYY to do exactly what you're doing, which is grab people from all over the city and bring them into WHYY and find ways to support each other. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that I wrote an article a couple of years ago, and the headline was something about why journalists should care about voter turnout, or why publishers should care about voter turnout. And it was essentially a business decision that said the people who vote and super voters are the same people who read the news, and the people who don't vote are less likely to read the news. So if journalists and editors and news publishers are intentional about curating voters and voter outreach and voter turnout, those people will become news consumers. Those people will become subscribers because they have a greater insight into what is at stake at an election. Because we talk about this, but we sometimes still keep it parallel. People don't vote because they don't have enough information. People who tend to vote a lot tend to read the news a lot, but there isn't a cross-pollination of those 2 groups. You don't ever see the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists or any journalist group and Committee of 70 having a summit about increasing voter participation in news disruption. And I see Eric's mind going because I'm thinking that's just something we should do, right?
I'm on it. I'm taking notes right now. And
Christopher, to your point too, like voter turnout goes up, right? Like we spend about 2 years thinking and talking constantly about a presidential election. I know people get tired of it and it feels like a lot because it is a lot, but then voter turnout goes up, right? When there's next to no conversation around judges or this, that, and the other thing, when it comes to municipal elections, then voter turnout goes down to like 13, 17, 20, 30 at the most. So yeah, like part of it is like, is it the chicken or the egg, right? Is it like, does the consumer, does the voter not click on sort of those articles about the judges, or are there not interesting enough articles about them, or does it not need to be written articles? Maybe this needs to be TikToks or
podcast
or something. I don't know, but it's a gigantic challenge, and one that I think so many people in media and news are trying to figure out, because I think my personal belief is that the vast majority of people in this country are progressive. The vast majority of people in this country care about other people and want things like, your neighbor not to go into debt because they have a healthcare issue, or for your other neighbor to not have access to childcare, right? Like, there are so many, this is just about people and love and community and support. There's 7 billion people in this world. We have to work together, right? Government has a role in helping us facilitate that. And I think, generally speaking, the more people we get to vote, the more we'll walk in that direction. But it's tough when you, even me with the judges, like, I'm just kind of a few days before doing hours of research, trying to figure out who are you voting for? What resource are you looking at? It's not easy.
But when you talk about personal responsibility, Eric, this is where I think, like Conrad said, the media, local newsrooms can only cover so much. This is where I think it becomes a responsibility of people in neighborhoods to commit acts of journalism and to not necessarily view themselves as a journalist. But, and that's what we always talk about in N.I.C.E. There's a difference between someone who is a journalist and people who commit acts of journalism. And people who commit acts of journalism sometimes have the same or greater impact than those who are journalists. When we look at the protest movement, when we look at George Floyd, the only reason that case went to trial and became as big as it was is because there was a 17-year-old girl who committed an act of journalism, who recorded something, broadcast it out, and shared it with their neighbors. And that's true for...
Held her hand there the whole time.
Right, didn't stop recording. But she didn't, in her head, she didn't think, I'm committing an act of journalism, but she did. But the more that we intentionally educate our public, the value of committing acts of journalism around elections, around policing issues, around civic issues, bringing a judge into your home like they did back in the day and have 7 people around a dinner table and talking to that person, and then writing a blog about it and sharing it with the next neighborhood, and then that passes around until a bigger source picks up on it. That's an ecosystem, right? And that's what we're trying to talk about, is transforming a local news ecosystem so that it's not such a top-heavy down where the only information is coming from editors and journalists and thinkers and pundits, but that there's this grassroots, up from the ground source of information that's meeting this top down. And when that happens, it bubbles and it expands out.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think, again, back to this theme of the future of journalism is people. This is exactly what we're talking about. It's people who need to be informed. It's people who make decisions. It's people who vote. And so all of this, I think Conrad...
And it's people who broadcast.
And it's people who broadcast, exactly. And I think to Conrad's question or concern about how difficult it is, it's really about just making the information digestible, right? When you talked about the number of judges that were running this year and how few people think about, I've often shared this concept that when I talk to people in the community about voting, I often ask the question, who are you more likely to encounter in your day-to-day life? The President of the United States or a sitting judge? Somebody who's like, your cousin might be, arrested for something, or there's something that's happening in your community you have to go before. The judges are more immediately, directly connected to and impacting our daily lives in ways that the president and vice president don't. And yet we're so uninformed about what they do, what the different courts are, and who's running. I think absolutely we have to figure out a way to make these topics informative, but also interesting, and be able to make that connection between people's daily lives and why it's important to vote.
I think what you said, Eric, is profound in the sense that it's not just about providing the information. The reason people go out in droves for a presidential election is because the media makes it a spectacle, and people like spectacles, and they get it, and it becomes a media 3-ring circus, and there's so much information about it. You feel like, I gotta do it. They've made the stakes clear. I know it's at stake. You know, it's about foreign policy and the military and healthcare and you know, women's rights and trans rights and gay rights and housing. It's all those things. But when it comes down to a city council race or a DA's race, the same level of fanfare and involvement and spectacle is not created. And so the public says it must not be as important.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, you can easily meet your state representatives, your Congress people, your district representatives, or what we have here in Philadelphia as council people. You can easily meet those people when they're running for office. You can get a sense of who they are as individuals to make a better informed decision. And yet we don't take advantage of that opportunity. So I think that's something that we're going to explore.
Absolutely.
We're definitely going to explore this more as the year goes on. But Conrad, I wanted to touch on, again, a little bit more about your relationship with WHYY, specifically the work you've been doing around our space. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about what your relationship has been to WHYY, both inside N.I.C.E and out, and how that relates to our space.
Yeah, so again, Streets Department focuses on art in the public space, which is a hyper-focused thing. But over the years, you know, public space more generally has been something that you can't talk about art in the public space without talking about public space, right? So they're intertwined. So over the years, I have been really interested and worked on projects like Civic Commons PHL, which looked at how to bring these different park organizations together to better serve communities around the city of Philadelphia, and done things like petitioned against building a Starbucks on Dilworth Park through a third-party vendor. But nevertheless, you know, what are the needs of people in the public space, and can't we just have some public space that isn't corporate, right? To go back to one of my earlier points, you know, everything's commercialized, right? To listen to the podcast, you have to listen to ads. You get ads on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and everywhere, right? So can we just at least sit in our park without seeing a Starbucks logo, especially when there's coffee shops across the street, when it's not an amenities issue? So with working with WHYY, you know, I pitched a few ideas, and Chris was really smart in, you know, leading me in the direction of what developed into our space, which is a monthly series exploring Philadelphia's public space from the perspective of art and creativity. We've only had a few. It's only been around for a couple of months, and we do monthly issues. But we've looked at a number of things, you know, on the sillier side. I grew up in Philly and have always wondered about the William Penn statue on top of City Hall. I have to figure out how to talk about this, but one angle that looks like the statue looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, as a kid, I joked about it. And as an adult, you know, you talk to people, half people see it, half had never thought about it before. So I talked with the editor at PlanPhilly, who is Ariella Cohen. And she was like, oh, I'd never thought about that either. Why don't you reach out to some people and see if this is actually something that's worth talking about? I reached out to a couple of tour guides, and they're all like, yes, people ask us about that all the time. People from Philly, people visiting Philly wonder what's going on there. So we investigated that and found the history there, which is actually really interesting. I won't spoil it for you, but I was surprised by the way that went. The first one we did was really important for me because it's something I've thought about for years, which was sort of the lack of access of public restrooms in cities like Philadelphia. Obviously, we're talking about Philadelphia, but it's an issue that happens in a lot of cities, particularly in the Northeast, that are more densely populated. This idea that you can be an Uber driver, or you can be a mail person, or you can just be walking around your city and have nowhere to go to the restroom. You know, it's a pretty bananas idea when you think about it. There are other cities, you know, this idea came to me after I visited an ex-boyfriend in Portland, Oregon, and there are restrooms in basically all of their public parks, including these individual stalls just randomly on busy street corners in their downtown called Portland Loos. There's basically always a place to go to the bathroom in Portland, which makes sense. There's 1.5 million people in the city of Philadelphia. There's 1.5 million people who have to use the restroom for any number of reasons throughout the day. So we explored that with our first issue and with our first segment, And that's something that we'll be fighting for forever. You know, it's a public health issue. I think COVID taught us that it always was, but it's made even stronger. Yeah, so the next one will be coming out soon.
I just wanted to say real quick, I think that it's brilliant and just so profound that you're able to take this love and interest for public space, for public art, for open spaces and areas across the city, and actually connect it to these basic human needs that we, as city administrations, we haven't thought of, or maybe they have thought of, but they haven't taken it seriously to really these issues that really impact our humanity. Like you said, it's a basic human need. We've got 1 million people, and yet we have not made these accommodations. I think that's profound, and I think I just love the fact that this is why we need you as part of N.I.C.E, and we need community members to start performing acts of journalism and talking about these things. That's important.
You know, one of the things, Eric, I think with Conrad's issue, product was very similar in its origin to POCs, because what he was super passionate about, correct me if I'm wrong, Conrad, wasn't the initial pitch. It was like, you pitched something that wasn't necessarily, and I don't know if you were thinking, let me pitch what WHYY wants, but I'm like, you love the public space, let's just go with that.
I pitched you an idea that would have made me the new Terry Gross. That was the idea. I was like,
really get there.
I was like, how do I get to be the new Terry Gross? I was like, let me interview scientists about black holes and stuff. And you were like, like, that's when I listen to podcasts about like science and like science fiction and like news and stuff. And I was like, oh, let me go in the new direction. And you were like, Conrad, you built a 10-year career talking about public space. Just keep talking about public space. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because there's so many new conversations to have there, right? Like the restroom one wouldn't have made sense for me to do with Streets Department alone, right? Like I retweet things and do like things on Instagram or whatever, but to have the funding support from WHYY and the support from editors and you to figure out like, how do we tell a story like that succinctly and have access to like, I got to interview people from the city about like, what is their response here? It's always a funding thing. Eric, to your point, or to what we were talking about before about like, when there's energy around some of these issues, oftentimes things do change. One of the first petitions I ever did was in 2014. I petitioned Dept to run the L and subway 24/7 because basically every job I had ended after midnight and the night out bus was not as reliable as the train was. And after a year, after a few thousand signatures on a petition, a bunch of press coverage of it, and then a year of testing, it became indefinite. Now COVID changed everything, but that was my first real example of like citizen activism. This small petition, hyper focused, hyper local, not millions of signatures. I think it had like 3,000 before they started testing the pilot. Shows that things can change. And then my more recent petition, again, talking about like what is the role of public space, of public land? Do we want things like coffee shops taking up every square inch of our public parks? It was an interesting debate, and I think one thing it did do was help Center City District understand that the current mechanisms in place to get things like that reviewed by the public were flawed because basically no one had heard about it before they announced it. So they made some changes to look at how they get information like that out to people before decisions like that are finalized. And with the public restrooms, the squeakiest wheel gets the grease. Our politicians work for us. I know it doesn't feel that way all the time, but when we scream about stuff, you might not get 100% what you want, but things move in that direction usually. It's another reason why when only 10% or 12% of the population votes, it's a disadvantage to the population as a whole.
Yeah. Well, as you alluded to, Conrad, in our first initial conversation, we talked for 3 hours, and I think we could talk for 3 hours more, but we got to wrap it up.
Do it. 3 hours.
I appreciate your time, man. I'm so glad that you are part of the WHYY family. This is N.I.C.E Behind the Scenes. Eric Marsh, Conrad Benner. I'm Chris Norris. Thank you guys so much for watching. We're out.